Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a figure that I think it's safe to say is one of the most, well, complex and controversial in recent history. Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, definitely complex.
To help us make sense of it all, we've got excerpts from Thomas R. Mockaitis' book, The Mystery of Osama bin Laden, an assessment.
Yeah.
And, you know, even the title kind of hints at what we're up against here.
It does. And Mockaitis himself, he's a military historian, pretty influential in the field of terrorism studies. He acknowledges right off the bat how elusive bin Laden is as a subject.
I mean, trying to understand the man behind, well, the infamy behind 9/11, it's got to be tough.
You've got the obvious challenges, right? Like years spent in hiding, the deliberate cultivation of this mystique. But Mockaitis digs deeper.
Oh, does he ever? Like, just trying to get a clear picture of bin Laden's early life. It's like chasing shadows.
Exactly. He points out how Saudi Arabia in the 60s and 70s, well, record-keeping just wasn't what it is today.
So birth certificates, school records, the kind of stuff biographers usually rely on.
Often scarce or non-existent.
And that's not even getting into the cultural aspects, right?
Right. Mockaitis talks about how even things like birthdays weren't necessarily emphasized, family photos were less common. So you're already starting with a very limited pool of verifiable information.
It's like trying to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
And then you add in the fact that many of the interviews Mockaitis relies on, they were conducted after bin Laden's rise to infamy.
So everyone's got an agenda. Everyone's got their own interpretation of who this guy was.
Exactly. Separating fact from fiction becomes this huge challenge.
And it's not just with the big stuff, right? I mean, Mockaitis even shares this anecdote where bin Laden claims his father, a devout man, prayed at 3 different holy mosques in a single day.
Which would have been physically impossible given the distances involved.
So even with personal details, there's this embellishment, this myth-making. It makes you wonder, where does the truth even begin?
And that's what's so crucial about taking a deep dive like this. We can't just accept any single account at face value.
We got to be critical, right? Look for those inconsistencies, the gaps in the narrative.
Exactly. We have to try to separate the self-constructed image from the historical reality.
Okay, so where do we even begin? If we're trying to understand bin Laden, the man, not just the monster the media made him out to be, where do we start?
Well, Mockaitis lays out some foundational facts. Bin Laden, born in Riyadh in 1957, comes from an incredibly wealthy family. The bin Laden construction empire, and he lost his father at a relatively young age.
And I'm guessing that gets a lot of attention. I mean, you often hear experts looking for those childhood traumas to explain how someone becomes a terrorist.
It's tempting to draw a straight line, right? But Mockaitis cautions against oversimplifying things.
He doesn't completely dismiss the psychological impact, though, right?
No, not at all. Losing a parent is a significant event. But he points out that plenty of children experience loss without becoming radicalized.
So what makes bin Laden different? There have to be something else there.
Well, one thing Mockaitis highlights is bin Laden's shyness in his youth.
Really? That's surprising. It doesn't exactly fit the image of a charismatic leader who inspires a global movement.
It is a striking contrast. And it suggests that maybe, at least in his early years, he wasn't this natural firebrand, this born leader.
So how does that shy kid become the figure we know as bin Laden?
That's the question, isn't it? Mockaitis points out that throughout his life, bin Laden seems to have been drawn to strong personalities, figures who could, well, shape his thinking.
Like who? Give us some examples.
In high school, it was a teacher who introduced him to radical interpretations of Islam. Later, of course, there's Abdullah Azzam, a key figure in the Afghan jihad.
Ah, Azzam, the one who preached defensive jihad, the obligation to fight against those occupying Muslim lands.
And of course, we can't forget Ayman al-Zawahiri, who would become bin Laden's right-hand man in Al-Qaeda.
Okay, so even if he wasn't born a zealot, he was surrounded by people who pushed him in that direction. But I guess it's not just about individual psychology, right? There's got to be a broader context here.
Absolutely. We have to consider the historical and cultural forces at play. Bin Laden didn't emerge in a vacuum.
So let's zoom out a bit. What were the major events that shaped his thinking? What was the world like as he came of age?
Well, bin Laden was born into a Middle East that was undergoing massive change, tons of political upheaval. Mockaitis points to the 1967 Six-Day War as a pivotal moment.
Oh yeah, the war where Israel defeated several Arab states in a matter of days.
Exactly. It was a humiliating defeat for the Arab world, and it really fueled a sense of resentment towards Israel and, by extension, the United States.
Because the U.S. was seen as Israel's ally, right?
Right. And this is where we start to see those seeds of conspiratorial thinking taking root. Mockaitis mentions bin Laden's belief that Jewish people control America, for instance.
That's a pretty extreme belief. But how widespread were those kinds of ideas at the time?
Mockaitis argues that they weren't just isolated thoughts. They were part of this larger wave of anti-Western sentiment and the rise of Islamism that was sweeping through the Middle East.
Okay, so it's not just about bin Laden's individual prejudices, but about this broader ideological movement that was gaining traction.
Right. And it's important to remember, we have to go beyond that simplistic notion that Islam is inherently violent. I mean, the core teachings of the religion emphasize peace, justice, compassion.
So how did bin Laden twist those teachings to fit his own agenda? How did he go from this shy, devout kid to, well, the figurehead of global jihad?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think the Afghan war against the Soviets was a major turning point.
Yeah, the war that, many saw as just another Cold War battle. But for bin Laden, it became something much more personal, much more religious.
It was a crucible. Mockaitis highlights the influence of Abdullah Azzam, who really promoted this concept of defensive jihad, that Muslims had a duty to fight anyone occupying Muslim lands.
And that idea, it clearly resonated deeply with bin Laden. But I remember reading that his role in the Afghan war was actually kind of surprising.
It is. He didn't actually fight on the front lines, charge into battle with a rifle in hand.
So what did he do?
He used his family's wealth. He funded fighters. He organized logistics, more of a behind-the-scenes role.
So even in those early days, he's more of a strategist, a financier.
Exactly. But even though he wasn't directly engaged in combat, that experience in Afghanistan, it seems to have had a profound impact on him.
It must have, right? War is brutal.
It is. And for bin Laden, it seems to have solidified this belief that he was divinely chosen to lead a global jihad.
Wow. That's a scary thought. And I guess this is where things really take a dark turn, right? Because the Afghan war, it wasn't just a chapter in his life. It was the birthplace of Al-Qaeda.
You could say that. What started as this relatively small group supporting Muslims in various conflicts, well, it morphed into something far more sinister.
And that's a story for part 2. So we left off with bin Laden in Afghanistan, kind of witnessing this birth of Al-Qaeda. You said it started small, but it sounds like things escalated pretty quickly.
They did. And there's this fascinating dynamic between bin Laden and Azzam, the scholar who, really influenced him with those ideas about defensive jihad.
Yeah, but it wasn't all smooth sailing, right? They had their differences.
Oh, yeah. There are some who speculate that bin Laden, even though he respected Azzam, maybe felt a bit intellectually inferior. And there's this growing ambition you start to see.
And then there's Azzam's death in '89, right?
Right, a car bomb. Never officially solved.
Super mysterious.
Mockaitis sort of lays out the different theories. But regardless of who was behind it, Azzam's death, it left a void in leadership.
A void that al-Zawahiri stepped right into. And he brought his own brand of radicalism to the table, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Al-Zawahiri was much more of a strategic thinker, very organized, a mind for, well, let's say, operational details. It was a potent combination. His intellect mixed with bin Laden's, I guess you could say, charisma and drive.
A dangerous partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And Mockaitis talks about Al-Qaeda's structure kind of evolving around this time. What was it like?
Imagine it like a corporate headquarters in Afghanistan, but overseeing this network of global cells.
Decentralized, huh?
Very much so. And that made them really hard to track, to dismantle, because each cell had a degree of autonomy.
Chillingly efficient. And it's around this time that their focus really shifted, right?
Yeah.
The United States becomes enemy number one.
Yeah. And those fatwas that bin Laden issued in 96 and 98, those were a turning point. They explicitly called for violence against Americans.
And there was a major shift in their ideology too, right? Because now they were targeting civilians.
Exactly. That was a huge departure from traditional Islamic teachings on warfare. Mockaitis actually quotes bin Laden saying something like, "We don't differentiate between those in military uniforms and civilians. They're all targets."
God, that's just horrifying. But was everyone in Al-Qaeda on board with that? Targeting innocent people?
There's some indication that even within Al-Qaeda's leadership, there were different views on this. Al-Zawahiri, for instance, he seemed to have a slightly more, nuanced approach.
So even within this group of extremists, there were shades of radicalism.
Exactly. And then, of course, comes 9/11. It's impossible to talk about bin Laden without discussing that day.
The day that changed everything.
Yeah. And it's the event that really cemented bin Laden's image as, well, the face of global terrorism. But there is one detail that Mockaitis brings up that I found really surprising.
What's that?
It seems that bin Laden, he wasn't actually directly involved in the operational planning of the 9/11 attacks.
Really? You mean like the nuts and bolts of how it was all going to go down?
Yeah. The evidence suggests that the mastermind behind 9/11 was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
So while bin Laden might not have been the tactical architect, he was still the inspiration, right? The figurehead who provided the ideological framework for it all.
Exactly. And his reaction to 9/11, I mean, that speaks volumes. He was reportedly elated by the attacks, saw it as a victory against the great Satan.
But it wasn't just about the immediate impact, right? Bin Laden was a strategist. He had to have been thinking long term.
He did. Mockaitis actually mentions this letter that bin Laden sent to a supporter just a few months after 9/11. It basically lays out his strategy, his plan to drag the U.S. into a protracted conflict, a war of attrition that would exhaust them both financially and, emotionally.
So he was already predicting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, basically.
Yeah, he anticipated America's first reaction, as he called it, would be to invade Afghanistan. But he went even further, suggesting they would then make serious, sometimes fatal mistakes, almost certainly referring to, the invasion of Iraq.
Wow. It's like he was trying to manipulate the U.S. into playing right into his hands.
That's the thing about bin Laden. He understood asymmetric warfare. He knew he could never defeat the West in a conventional fight, so he aimed to undermine their political will, to turn public opinion against the war effort.
And Al-Qaeda's strategy after 9/11, it seemed to have multiple layers, right? Like a three-pronged approach.
Right. Mockaitis talks about it. First, you tie down U.S. forces in those long, draining wars. Second, you consolidate your base, preferably somewhere remote and hard to reach like the mountains of South Asia. And third, you establish these franchises, these offshoots around the world.
And those franchises, they were key, weren't they? Because it allowed Al-Qaeda to spread their influence without directly controlling every attack.
Exactly. It made them so much harder to contain. It was no longer just a hierarchical organization, but this global network with tentacles reaching into different countries, inspiring independent actors.
So bin Laden was essentially orchestrating a global movement from the shadows.
Very much so. And he was very active in shaping the narrative, releasing those audio tapes, those written statements, really trying to control how the conflict was being perceived.
There's that chilling audio tape from 2002 where he addresses the American people directly. What was he trying to achieve with that?
It's fascinating because you can see his twisted logic at work. He's trying to justify 9/11 as a retaliation for various U.S. policies, things like their support for Israel, the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, the sanctions on Iraq.
But he goes beyond specific grievances, doesn't he? He attacks American culture itself.
Oh, yeah. He calls it the worst civilization witnessed by the history of mankind. It's clear he's trying to provoke a clash of civilizations, to frame the whole conflict as Islam versus the West.
Such a dangerous and misleading narrative. But did it resonate with people?
Sadly, it did, especially among those who already felt marginalized, disenfranchised. And that's what made combating Al-Qaeda so challenging. It wasn't just about military force. It was about countering this really potent, really seductive narrative.
So while the U.S. was pouring resources into the war on terror, bin Laden was waging a different kind of war. A war of ideas, a war of propaganda.
Precisely. And he was incredibly skilled at it. I mean, this was before the rise of social media, but he still utilized the internet, videotapes, satellite phones, anything to reach a wider audience.
It was like this early form of online radicalization years before it became the phenomenon we see today.
And it wasn't just about recruitment. It was about instilling fear, about creating this sense of vulnerability in the West. Bin Laden knew that even a few successful attacks could have this massive psychological impact.
Didn't he also become obsessed with acquiring weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, he actually declared it a religious duty to obtain them. Now, there's no evidence that he ever actually succeeded, but the mere threat of it, that just added another layer of anxiety to the whole post-9/11 world.
Okay, so we've got Al-Qaeda regrouping, a global network of these franchises operating with some degree of autonomy, and this constant stream of propaganda. What happens next?
Well, as Mockaitis describes it, the years following 9/11, they saw a wave of terrorist attacks around the world. You had Bali, Madrid, London. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, they were leaving this trail of bloodshed across the globe. Yeah, so these attacks, I mean, they weren't random acts of violence. Each one was carefully chosen to maximize its impact, both in terms of casualties and, well, psychological effects.
Right. Like those bombings in Bali in 2002. They targeted Western tourists.
Exactly. It was a direct attack on globalization, and it sent this message that nowhere was safe.
And then you had the Madrid train bombings in 2004, just days before the general election.
It felt like Al-Qaeda was trying to, well, directly influence political outcomes through violence.
And the 2005 London bombings? Those were carried out by homegrown terrorists, weren't they?
Yeah.
It really brought home the threat of radicalization within Western societies.
It showed that the threat wasn't just external anymore. It was coming from within.
It's terrifying to think that these horrific events were part of some calculated strategy. But I guess in a way, each attack also provided valuable information for intelligence agencies, right?
Absolutely. Forensic analysis, interrogations, intercepted communications, all of that helped to, piece together Al-Qaeda's tactics and networks.
But as those agencies adapted, so did Al-Qaeda. They became even more decentralized, harder to track.
Yeah, it's almost like a dark parallel to the evolution of technology, Just as the internet was becoming more distributed, so was Al-Qaeda's structure. Harder to take down because there wasn't just one head to cut off.
It's a chilling thought, globalization.
Yeah.
Enabling the spread of terror instead of, cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, the U.S. was bogged down in those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, just as bin Laden had hoped.
Yeah, it was a real strategic quagmire. Resources were stretched thin. Public support for the wars was waning. And bin Laden was exploiting that, really pushing this narrative that the U.S. was waging a war against Islam itself.
He was such a master manipulator, wasn't he? Turning genuine grievances into, fuel for his extremist agenda. But how is it that this guy, this man in hiding, could exert such a profound influence on global events?
That's the key question, isn't it? And I think Mockaitis makes a really compelling argument. He says that bin Laden's power really stemmed from this unique combination of things: strategic brilliance, his mastery of propaganda, and just the historical moment in which he was operating.
So let's break that down. Let's start with the strategy. What made him so effective?
Well, bin Laden understood asymmetric warfare, right? He knew he couldn't defeat the West in a head-to-head fight. So he focused on exploiting their vulnerabilities, provoke overreaction, drain their resources, erode public support for the war on terror. It was a long game.
And then there's the propaganda. He was so skilled at amplifying his message.
He was a pioneer, really. I mean, he was using the internet, videotapes, satellite phones, anything to reach a wider audience. It was a blueprint for the online radicalization that we see today. He was ahead of his time in that way.
He was also brilliant at framing the conflict as this clash of civilizations, really twisting history and religion to fit his narrative.
Yeah, and sadly it worked on some people, particularly those who already felt marginalized or disenfranchised. And that's a crucial lesson for us, I think. We need to address the root causes of resentment and extremism, not just the symptoms.
It's not enough to just fight the terrorists. You got to fight the ideology that creates them. So bin Laden, even from hiding, managed to shape global events in a profound way. His actions had a ripple effect, influencing policies, military strategies, public discourse, everything.
It's a stark reminder that individuals, even those operating outside traditional power structures, can have a massive impact on the course of history.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's really important to remember the victims of bin Laden's terror, because their stories remind us of the very real, the very human cost of extremism and the urgency of combating it.
Yeah, we can't forget them. But beyond the tragedy, there are lessons to be learned, I think. Understanding the factors that led to bin Laden's rise, his strategic brilliance, that seductive power of his propaganda, it can help us better confront the challenges of extremism that we face in our own time.
It's about recognizing the complexities of the world, resisting simplistic narratives, and, engaging in genuine dialogue that addresses those root causes of violence.
And it's about understanding that the fight against terrorism, it's not just about military might. It's about countering extremist ideologies, promoting tolerance, building a more just and equitable world.
And as you process all this information, we encourage you to think critically, to challenge assumptions, and to consider the lasting legacy of bin Laden's dark vision.
And maybe the most important question to ask ourselves is, How can we, both as individuals and as a global community, prevent the emergence of another bin Laden,
Wow.
another ideology that twists faith into, this weapon of terror? That's the challenge. And it demands our attention, our critical thinking, our commitment to building a world where, peace and understanding prevail.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.